Alright, so welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about how to create space in an artwork, and we're going to be looking specifically at two-dimensional pieces. So for this task, we're going to be looking primarily at one image by a graphic novelist of the name Marjane Satrapi. She is an Iranian artist and storyteller that's talking about the Iranian Revolution. So this is where the imagery comes from, and we're going to be looking at how she is able to create visual interest in her work by creating spatial relationships, but really only looking at very simple kind of black and white images as well. Okay, so as we're going through here, okay, the first thing that we need to do is recognize that we are working in a two-dimensional media, right? We're working on some sort of flat support, whether it's paper or perhaps a canvas, for example, right? So how do we create that illusion of depth with recognizing that we're working on a flat surface, okay? So the first thing that we need to do is recognize that there are three kind of zones within the image. The foreground, which is typically down near the bottom of the image, okay, the middle ground, which kind of stretches across the center portion, and then the background, which is usually up near the top. Okay, and as we go through today's lesson, we're going to notice that there are specific strategies for how we represent our subject within these three different zones. Okay, so the main techniques that we're going to be using, okay, are size relationships, the placement of our objects, using overlapping, changes in value, consideration of detail, atmospheric perspective, and linear perspective. And we're going to go through each of these 7 different strategies or techniques individually in order to help you figure out how to use them in your own work. The first one is the idea of size. Okay? What we do know is that objects that are closer to us tend to be bigger. Right? And then this is just the way that our eyes perceive the world around us. So, for example, if you are standing right in front of a car, it's going to look really large. But if you see a car that is traveling by often in the distance, it looks small, right? But even though it looks small, we do understand it to be a large vehicle, right? And in this case, right, we know that most people are kind of generally-ish the same size, right? And as a result, we can read that these figures over here are closer to us because they are larger. There's a sense of distance, right? Because now we're seeing the whole body of these two figures here, right? That they're a little bit farther away, and that these ones over off in the top right-hand corner are much smaller, and we know that they're farther away, right? But we also understand that these people here in reality are the same size-ish as the people that are in the foreground, right? And it's that understanding of how size works across distance that allows us to then use it as a strategy on a two-dimensional surface. Our second idea here that we need to think about is the placement, okay? And this goes back to those zones that we were talking about earlier, right? Typically, what we will do is use the bottom zone of the image for the things that are closer to us in order to create that sense of depth, right? Then we have the midground, and then the background tends to be higher up. What's interesting about what Satrapi has done in this particular image is that she's kind of broken that kind of vertical hierarchy and moved it into a more horizontal, right? So that the things that are in the foreground are now on the left, the midground are again kind of in the center, and then the things that are often in the distance are up in the top right. So we kind of have the zones going left to right instead of up and down, right? And there's a slight angle there as well, which helps to create that sense, okay? So we have size and we have the placement of objects. And then next, we have the idea that things need to overlap. And when objects or figures overlap with each other, we read it as though the thing that we see more of is closer to us. Okay, so in this case, right, we have this police figure here with a bit of a club that's now overlapping the figure. Okay? And by doing this overlapping, it helps to emphasize that these characters here are in front of these characters here. And we still see that, right, that same strategy used here, and we see it used here, and we see it used repeatedly over in the left-hand side of the image. Okay, so by overlapping, right, we are visually literally placing one object in front of the other. Our fourth strategy is using a change in value. Right? So this one's a little bit tricky in this particular example, right? But the idea is that there's more kind of balance of white and black in the foreground, and there's creating a stronger sense of shading, and there are less variety in the values over at in the background area. Okay, so we have changes in value, and this is also related to a concept called atmospheric perspective, which we will be getting to shortly as well. Okay. Our fifth strategy, okay, again, based on this idea of those three zones, foreground, middle ground, background, okay, is the idea of details. Objects that are closer to us, we see more detail. As we move into the middle ground, the details get simplified, and then often by the time things get into the background, there are hardly any details, again, whatsoever. Okay, and we're going to, again, build on this as we go into explaining atmospheric perspective, because this strategy is based on literally how we see the world around us. Okay, so here we go, atmospheric perspective. Okay, this is the phenomenon in which the atmosphere or the air creates different visual effects, and artists have learned different strategies, right, as such as detail and such as how value is used in order to create that natural effect of how we see the world. Okay, so number one, we have lighter values up in the background, okay, as we talked about earlier. Okay, but we also then see that there is less detail as we move from foreground to background, right? We can start to see some of the individual shading and the veins in the hand and some of the texture in the rock, but those similar textures and details have been very, very simplified up in the background spaces as well, right? So we have this idea of atmospheric perspective. All right, so take a moment and just kind of get a sense of how atmospheric perspective actually works. Right, so if you are able to stand on at a window that you can see a fairly good distance away, right? So if you're just looking across the street, you're not really going to see this, right? But imagine you're standing at the corner of an intersection, right? Perhaps one that's near the school, and you're looking down the street, right, towards the horizon, right? Where the earth meets the sky, right? That's our horizon line, right? That's the farthest point that we can possibly see. And as the light travels through the air, it kind of gets reflected and refracted a little bit because of the atmosphere. And it's that process that creates that overall sense of lightness as things get farther away from us, but it's also what removes the detail from our line of sight. Okay. The last strategy that we're going to talk about is the use of linear perspective. Okay, this was a strategy that was developed in Italy back in the early 1400s by somebody by the name of Filippo Brunelleschi, an Italian architect and painter. Lots was kind of, artists at the time were trying to figure out how to create that sense of space on a flat surface, as painting was the sort of one of the prime means of visually communicating the values of the society at the time. Okay? So here we have that idea of a vanishing point and the horizon, and that as when we have structures in particular, we can use the rules of perspective in order to emulate or create the illusion of three-dimensional space, because naturally the horizontal lines recede to a common point, which is called the vanishing point, right? And here we have a very complex example of how perspective is used. We have one vanishing point that is being used in order to kind of create the height of the buildings, but we also have another vanishing point that's down at the bottom in order to kind of create the sense of scale and the action of Spider-Man coming towards us. All right, we also have very simple one-point perspective strategies in which we can see here the just the simplicity of having the door have all of the lines come towards this vanishing point that's outside of the frame in order to help create that sense of depth. Okay? So we have 7 strategies. Okay? Make sure that you're thinking about these as you're creating your own two-dimensional artworks. Right? You don't necessarily have to use all of them, but combining 2 or 3 can go a long way in helping to create more sophisticated imagery overall. Okay? Best of luck with your next drawing adventure, and if you have any questions, please make sure that you're asking. Okay? So long, take care, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye.